the chilling mystery of a king's death in the annals of English history. The fate of Edward II has always lingered like a half-whispered rumor in a dimly lit chamber, half-truth, half-nightmare. Few royal deaths have stirred such fascination, horror, and disbelief. The official record is disarmingly plain. The king died of natural causes in 1327, a prisoner in Berkeley Castle. Yet from the moment news spread across England, few believed it. Instead, darker accounts rose from the shadows, carried by chroniclers and gossiped in taverns, that Edward had been murdered in a way so cruel, so symbolically charged, that it could not have been coincidence. The whispered story went like this. A group of men crept into his chamber, restrained the fallen king, and forced upon him an execution both grotesque and theatrical, a red-hot iron rod driven into his body, leaving no outward wounds but destroying him from within. It was a method, chosen not only to kill, but to shame, a punishment set to reflect what his enemies viewed as Edward's greatest sins for centuries. Historians have debated the truth of this story. Was it real, or was it a later invention, blackening the names of his captors? The mystery has endured, precisely because it is so layered, part political necessity, part personal vendetta, part cultural theater of humiliation. To unravel Edward II's death is to glimpse the brutality of medieval power, where a king's body was not just a vessel of life, but a canvas for punishment, propaganda, and fear. But Edward's end cannot be understood without tracing the long and tragic path that led him there. He was not born to be forgotten. Edward Plantagenet entered the world in 1284. The son of Edward I Longshanks, the iron-willed conqueror who subjugated Wales and thundered north into Scotland with sword and fire. From birth, the boy was expected to embody the same warrior spirit. Kingship in medieval England was not just a crown, it was an armor, a shield, a warhorse beneath the king's thighs. To rule meant to lead men into battle, to pray with fervor, to secure the succession with children, and above all to embody strength. And yet, Edward II seemed almost designed to disappoint these expectations. Where his father reveled in conquest, the son preferred music, pageantry, swimming, and the company of men who stirred controversy. Where kings were expected to forge alliances through marriage, Edward formed attachments that bewildered and scandalized his nobles. In many ways, Edward was a man out of place in his own century. Medieval society demanded rigid hierarchies, uncompromising displays of masculinity, and the suppression of personal desires in service to dynasty. Edward, however, seemed unwilling or perhaps unable to mask his true self, and in that refusal lay the seeds of his ruin that by the time he ascended the throne in 1307. Following his father's death, his reputation already raised eyebrows among the barons who expected a strong warrior king. Instead, they saw a monarch more interested in jousts, revels, and the companionship of a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston than in matters of war or state. That bond, whether it was friendship, romance, or both, would become the first spark in the chain of events that dragged Edward II from the grandeur of a coronation to the filth of a prison cell. His reign became a cautionary tale almost in real time. Disasters in war, humiliations at home, bitter feuds with his wife Isabella, and above all, his stubborn devotion to favorites who siphoned power and wealth while alienating the nobility. Each misstep deepened the impression that Edward was unfit to wear the crown that once rested so firmly on his father's brow, and so, by the time the autumn winds of 1327 swept across the high stone walls of Berkeley Castle, Edward II was a king in name only. His wife Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, ruled in his son's stead. His enemies, now masters of the realm, faced a question that haunted medieval politics. What does one do with a deposed king? A living ex-monarch was a permanent threat, a rallying figure for rebellion, a dangerous reminder of legitimacy. Thus the decision was made. Edward II would not leave Berkeley Castle alive. How exactly that decision was carried out, however, remains clouded by rumor and deliberate obfuscation. Did he waste away in neglect, broken by foul air and despair, or was his death a spectacle of cruelty, meant to mark him forever as a warning? The chronicler's answer, shocking, grotesque, unforgettable, ensured that his story would echo across centuries. Yet this is not simply the tale of one king's death. It is the story of how power twists love into betrayal, how politics weaponize shame, and how medieval justice was often less about fairness than about theater. To uncover what truly happened that September night, we must follow Edward from the cradle to the castle cell, from the shadow of his father to the flames of his supposed murder. His downfall was not sudden, but a slow unwinding of fortune, ambition, and trust. And it is there, in his early life, that the roots of tragedy first take hold. A prince in the shadow of a warrior, King Edward of Carnarvon, later Edward II, was born on April 25, 1284, in a stone fortress overlooking the rugged Welsh landscape. His birthplace, Carnarvon Castle, was no accident of geography. It was a deliberate symbol of conquest. His father, Edward I, had subdued Wales with an iron fist, raising mighty castles as monuments to English power. The birth of a royal son there was meant to seal the conquest with blood and legacy. But Edward II was the fourth son, not the heir apparent. For the first years of his life, he was never expected to rule. His older brothers Jan Henry Alf between him and the throne. Fate, however, has its own designs. One by one, they died young, leaving the quiet, less promising Edward as the sole surviving male heir. From that moment, he was no longer simply a royal child. He was the vessel into which the hopes and demands of a dynasty were poured, yet the expectations that clung to him were a crushing weight. Edward I, known to history as Longshanks, was the archetype of the medieval warrior king. Tall, imposing, relentless, he marched armies across Britain and France, wielding his authority like a weapon. He was a man whose very presence demanded obedience, a ruler forged in steel and conquest. His son, in contrast, was softer and drawn to the arts, music, and companionship than to the brutal arithmetic of war. The contrast could not have been starker. Chroniclers of the time, steeped in the ideals of medieval kingship, saw in young Edward a worrying deficiency. Where his father was iron, he was clay. Where Edward I had conquered Wales, humbled Scotland, and struck fear into nobles, Edward II delighted in swimming, rowing, gardening, and the company of commoners. There is a telling anecdote of Edward enjoying the company of laborers and carpenters, even lending a hand in manual tasks, behavior that may seem charming to us, but which horrified the nobility. A king was meant to be set apart, untouchable, God's chosen vessel on earth. Edward blurred those lines in ways that made his peers uneasy. Medieval society was built upon unyielding expectations of its kings. To rule England in the 14th century was to embody strength on every front, military, spiritual, and dynastic. Kings were to lead armies, win battles, guard the faith, and secure succession through strong marriages. Any deviation from this script was interpreted not as individuality, but as weakness, dangerous weakness. But Edward's nature resisted such molds. He was affectionate, impulsive, and often careless in judgment. His capacity for loyalty to friends was genuine and intense, but it came at the expense of broader political calculation. He lavished favor on individuals he loved, while neglecting the simmering resentments of the powerful nobility. This imbalance, so innocent in youth, would one day shake the very foundations of his crown. The shadow of Edward I loomed heavily over him. The old king was not blind to his son's shortcomings. Records suggest Edward I grew frustrated with his heir's lack of martial discipline and his troubling attachment to companions like Piers Gaveston. Even before the boy inherited the crown, some historians speculate that Longshanks feared his son would squander all he had built, for Edward I's ambitions were vast: to unite Britain under his rule, to elevate England to the stature of a European powerhouse. He had envisioned a dynasty of warrior kings. Instead, he left behind a boy who preferred music to military drills. Yet it would be unfair to dismiss Edward II as merely weak. He was in many ways a man ahead of his time, someone unwilling to suppress his personality in the suffocating armor of medieval kingship. His interests in art, pageantry, and companionship reflected a more human, less calculated side of monarchy. But such traits, in the unforgiving world of the 14th century, were liabilities, not virtues. His unwillingness or inability to conform to the role carved out for him would soon create rifts that no crown could mend. By the time Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, he carried with him both the immense legacy of a father remembered as one of England's greatest kings and the crushing burden of expectation. He was a young man unprepared for the storms of politics, stepping into a role that demanded iron discipline, ruthless decisiveness, and unyielding strength. What he brought instead was tenderness, loyalty, and a hunger for affection. And in a medieval court where affection could be political dynamite, that hunger would prove catastrophic. It would manifest most explosively in his devotion to one man, Piers Gaveston. Their bond would ignite a scandal that shook the nobility, destabilized the realm, and set Edward on the tragic path that would one day lead to Berkeley Castle. Gaveston loved friendship and scandal. When Edward II ascended the throne in July 1307, the court quickly learned that this new king would be unlike his father. His first major act as monarch was not the careful appointment of seasoned advisors, nor a demonstration of military strength, but the immediate recall of a single man from exile, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a Gascon, knight of middling birth who had first entered Edward's orbit as a companion in his youth. What began as camaraderie grew into an attachment so profound that it alarmed Edward I, who banished Gaveston from England in 1306. Chroniclers suggest that Longshanks feared his son's obsession with Gaveston undermined discipline, dignity, and the line between king and subject. Edward I reportedly told his nobles he wanted to teach the lad a lesson by separating him from this dangerous influence. Yet scarcely had the old king died than Edward II defied his father's command. Gaveston was recalled, showered with wealth, and elevated to the lofty title of Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. This was no minor favor. It was a provocative signal to the nobility that Edward valued Gaveston above them all. The reaction was swift and bitter, for the English baron's honor was a currency as vital as land or coin. Gaveston's sudden rise, felt like an insult, not merely because of his low birth, but because Edward bestowed upon him privileges they themselves coveted. Chroniclers describe Gaveston as flamboyant, witty, and arrogant, with a flair for mocking the highborn lords who despised him. At tournaments he outshone them with his skill and swagger. In court he delighted in giving cruel nicknames to England's most powerful men. These humiliations cut deeply, and the memory of them would not fade. But behind the political friction lay an even more incendiary question: the nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship. Medieval chroniclers, hostile as they were, stopped short of outright accusations, but their insinuations were clear. The king's affection for Gaveston was immoderate, excessive, beyond the due measure of friendship. Some even suggested it was carnal. Modern historians tread carefully here. The language of chroniclers was often colored by prejudice and politics. Intense male friendships in the Middle Ages were not unusual, often celebrated in the tradition of courtly love. Yet the depth of Edward's devotion to Gaveston, lavishing gifts, titles, and loyalty upon him at the expense of the realm, suggests that their bond was far more than simple friendship. Whether or not it was sexual is a question that may never be fully answered, but what mattered then was perception. To the nobility, Edward's favoritism was intolerable. The barons demanded Gaveston's removal, and under pressure, Edward reluctantly sent him into exile. Yet even abroad, Gaveston lived in luxury, funded by the king. Edward never abandoned him. Like a man possessed, he engineered his return again and again, each time reigniting noble fury. This cycle of exile and recall created a dangerous pattern: Edward's private loyalty versus the public demands of governance. Every time he clung to Gaveston, he alienated the barons further. His love or loyalty, or obsession, became a political fault line, splitting the kingdom in two. By 1312, matters came to a head. The barons, led by Thomas of Lancaster, could no longer tolerate Gaveston's presence. They captured him near Warwick and staged what can only be described as a judicial murder. Dragged before his enemies, Gaveston was executed without royal trial. His head was struck from his body, and the king's beloved companion lay dead. The impact on Edward was devastating. Chroniclers describe him as heartbroken, consumed with grief, his reign shaken to its core. Yet even in tragedy, the nobility saw only vindication. To them, Gaveston had been a dangerous parasite on the crown, and his death was a brutal but necessary correction. Still, Edward never forgot. The memory of Gaveston haunted him, shaping his future attachments and deepening his mistrust of the nobility who had destroyed the man he cherished. His reliance on favorites would not end with Gaveston's death. It would only grow more dangerous, for in Gaveston's place would rise another companion, Hugh Despenser, whose greed and cruelty would plunge the realm into chaos. But before Despenser's shadow fell across England, Edward faced another test of kingship: war with Scotland. In 1314, he marched north to prove himself a warrior king, to finally step out from under his father's shadow. Instead, he suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in English history, a disaster that shattered his credibility and confirmed his enemies' worst suspicions about his fitness to rule. Bannockburn, the humiliation of a king. If Gaveston's death left Edward II broken in spirit, the summer of 1314 broke him in reputation. For a medieval king, nothing mattered more than military prowess. A crown might be won in council chambers, but it was secured on the battlefield. Edward I had built his image upon endless campaigns against the Welsh and Scots. His very name struck fear north of the border. Edward II, desperate to prove himself worthy of that legacy, chose his moment in June 1314, a campaign to relieve the English garrison besieged in Stirling Castle, and in doing so, to crush the Scots once and for all. The result was catastrophe. The Scots, under the brilliant leadership of Robert the Bruce, lured the English into terrain that neutralized their superior numbers. At Bannockburn, just outside Stirling, Edward's massive host, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 strong, met a smaller, hungrier Scottish army of around 7,000, but the ground favored the Scots. Narrow approaches, marshy fields, and clever use of dense formations of spearmen that turned English cavalry into floundering chaos. The battle stretched across 2 brutal days. On the first, the Scots held firm. On the second, they shattered the English lines. Chroniclers tell of panic, of knights trampled by their own men, of the king's standard flying above a field of slaughter. At one point, Edward himself was nearly captured, an outcome that would have changed the course of English history entirely. Only the speed of his horse and the loyalty of a few companions saved him from falling into Bruce's hands. The King of England fled the battlefield in disgrace, galloping 90 miles south to Dunbar before securing passage home. His vast army lay in ruins behind him. Bannockburn was more than a military defeat, it was a humiliation of mythic proportions. Edward II had not only failed to conquer Scotland, he had fled like a common knight, abandoning his men. In the eyes of his subjects, he had betrayed the very essence of kingship. Chroniclers were merciless. To them, Edward was no warrior king but a coward, unfit to rule. The contrast with his father could not have been sharper. Edward I had been the hammer of the Scots, while Edward II became their laughingstock. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Scotland emerged from Bannockburn, emboldened, its independence solidified for a generation. English morale collapsed. And at home, Edward's political capital, already strained by his favoritism and failures, dwindled to dust. The nobility saw in him not just weakness but danger. A weak king was worse than a cruel one, for weakness imperiled the whole realm in the years that followed. Edward's reign became a seesaw of fragile truces and renewed conflicts with his own barons. He could not rule alone, his nature did not permit it. And so he turned again to favorites, men who could provide the companionship and loyalty he craved, but who inevitably drew the hatred of the nobility. Where Gaveston had been flamboyant, Edward's next great favorite would be ruthless. That man was Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston was a thorn in the nobility's pride, Despenser would become a knife in their ribs, greedy, cunning, and ambitious. He exploited Edward's affection to amass power on a scale that destabilized the entire kingdom. His rise would not only drive the barons to rebellion, it would fracture Edward's marriage, turn his queen into his deadliest enemy, and ultimately seal the king's doom. For with the Despensers came not just corruption, but cruelty. And in their shadow, Edward II's reign lurched toward its bloody and infamous conclusion. The Despensers and the Queen of Peers. Gaveston had been Edward II's great passion. Hugh Despenser the Younger became his fatal obsession. Unlike Gaveston, who delighted in flaunting his superiority over the barons, Despenser was cold, calculating, and endlessly ambitious. He was also married to Eleanor de Clare, Edward's niece, which tied him directly to the royal family. This gave his rise the appearance of legitimacy, though in truth his power came entirely from the king's devotion. By the early 1320s, Despenser and his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had transformed themselves into the most powerful figures. In England their greed was breathtaking. They seized estates, manipulated the law, and terrorized the nobility into submission. The younger Despenser, in particular, wielded Edward's affection as both shield and sword, positioning himself as the indispensable favorite. Chroniclers record that Edward could hardly bear to be apart from him, a closeness that echoed the earlier relationship with Gaveston but carried even darker political consequences. The Despensers' dominance poisoned Edward's court. Nobles who opposed them found themselves stripped of lands, imprisoned, or worse. The king's government became less about the welfare of the realm and more about serving Despenser's insatiable hunger for wealth and influence. Inevitably, rebellion followed. In 1321, a coalition of disaffected lords rose in open revolt, demanding the expulsion of the Despensers. For a moment, Edward seemed cornered. He exiled his beloved favorites under pressure, much as he had with Gaveston, but the king's attachment proved unbreakable. Within months he recalled them, and this time he acted with unusual ruthlessness. Edward and Despenser struck back against the rebels, crushing them at the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322. Several leading barons were executed, among them Thomas of Lancaster, once one of the most powerful men in the realm. For a brief moment it seemed Edward had finally asserted himself, but victory carried a bitter price. With Lancaster dead and the opposition cowed, the Despensers were freer than ever to plunder. Their tyranny spread like rot through the kingdom, breeding resentment at every level of society. Even Edward's queen, Isabella of France, found herself humiliated. Isabella had once been a dutiful wife, enduring Edward's neglect and his consuming attachments to Gaveston and then Despenser. She was the daughter of the formidable Philip of France, a king renowned for his cunning and authority. Yet in England, she was increasingly sidelined, her influence smothered by the Despensers. Worse still, she was treated with open disrespect. Lands that were hers by right were confiscated and handed to Hugh Despenser. Her household was reduced to a queen. This was not merely a slight, it was a declaration of war, and Isabella was no passive victim. Beneath her outward piety and regal composure lay a calculating mind and a steel will inherited from her father. She bided her time, watching as Edward's devotion to Despenser alienated every corner of the realm. Where others saw despair, she saw opportunity. That opportunity arrived in 1325. England and France were once again at odds over disputed territories. Edward, distrustful of leaving the kingdom in his absence, sent Isabella to France as a diplomatic envoy out of England, out of Despenser's reach. She began to plot. In the French court she found sympathy and support, and, more importantly, she found an ally in Roger Mortimer, an exiled English lord with a personal vendetta against Edward and the Despensers. Their partnership was scandalous, their bond rumored to be both political and romantic. But it was also deadly effective. Together, Isabella and Mortimer began to assemble an invasion force, drawing upon exiled Englishmen and foreign mercenaries. In 1326, they sailed for England, not as supplicants, but as conquerors. The invasion was swift, almost shockingly so. Edward and the Despensers discovered that their cruelty had left them friendless. Nobles and commons alike flocked to Isabella's banner. Towns opened their gates, armies defected. Within weeks, Edward's regime collapsed. He and Hugh Despenser fled west, hoping to rally support, but the kingdom had turned against them. Despenser's fate was brutal. Captured in November 1326, he was dragged before a jeering crowd. His execution was one of the most gruesome spectacles of the Middle Ages. Hanged, disemboweled, and quartered, his remains displayed as a warning. The man who had ruled England through Edward's affection was reduced to a butchered corpse, and Edward himself, the King of England, once crowned in splendor at Westminster, found himself a fugitive, abandoned, betrayed, and hunted. He was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III. The once mighty monarch was now a prisoner, his crown gone, his companions dead, his enemies triumphant. Yet the story of Edward II did not end with deposition. What awaited him in captivity would become one of the most infamous mysteries in English history, a death whispered about in scandal, immortalized in legend, and forever shrouded in uncertainty. The fall of a king. The winter of 1326 was a season of reckoning. Edward II, abandoned by his people, found himself fleeing across the countryside with his last and most hated favorite, Hugh Despenser. The hunted pair rode desperately westward, hoping to reach the safety of Wales. But England was no longer Edward's kingdom, it was Isabella's. Everywhere they went, doors were closed, loyalties shifted, and roads grew perilous. At last, near Llantrisant in South Wales, their luck ran out. Betrayed and captured, Edward and Despenser were dragged before Isabella and Mortimer's triumphant court. For Edward, the humiliation was total. The once king now stood powerless before his estranged wife, a queen transformed into his conqueror. For Despenser, the end was swift and unspeakably cruel. His execution at Hereford was designed not only to punish but to terrify. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his mutilated body displayed across the realm. The cheers of the mob echoed the hatred he had sown. Edward was spared immediate death, but not dignity. Imprisoned at Kenilworth Castle, he faced the inevitable deposition. On January 20, 1327, he was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son, now King Edward III. Chroniclers record the scene with pathos, a broken man weeping as he surrendered the crown, declaring that he did so willingly to preserve peace in the kingdom. Whether those words were his own or dictated by his captors, they marked the end of his reign. For Isabella and Mortimer, victory was sweet but fragile. They had overthrown a king, but Edward II alive remained a danger. So long as he breathed, conspiracies could form around him, rebels could claim his restoration, and his son's legitimacy could be questioned. Thus, Edward was transferred into deeper captivity, eventually sent to the remote and brooding fortress of Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. That it was there, in the damp stone chambers of Berkeley, that Edward II's fate took its infamous turn. The chronicles grow murky, filled with rumor, contradiction, and horror. What is certain is that by September 1327, word spread that the former king was dead. The manner of his passing, however, became one of the great scandals of medieval Europe. According to one account, Edward was murdered by the insertion of a red-hot poker into his body, a grotesque method chosen, it was said, to leave no visible marks and to mock his rumored sexual proclivities. This story, lurid and unforgettable, spread rapidly, searing itself into popular memory. Even centuries later, the image of Edward's fiery death remained one of the most notorious tales in English history. Yet modern historians question this account. Some suggest Edward may have died of illness, neglect, or mistreatment. Others argue that the gruesome story was propaganda, concocted to blacken Isabella and Mortimer's names. A few even claim Edward may have survived, escaping to Europe and living out his days in obscurity. Unlikely but tantalizing possibility. What is undeniable is this: Edward II's death, whether by violence or by despair, sealed his transformation from failed king to tragic figure. He was laid to rest in Gloucester Cathedral, where his magnificent tomb still stands, a monument as much to legend as to history. But his story did not end quietly. Isabella and Mortimer, the architects of his downfall, soon discovered that power, won through betrayal, is fragile. Within just 3 years, Edward III, the boy they had made king, would seize control of his throne. Overthrowing his mother and her lover, Mortimer was executed, Isabella was disgraced, and the cycle of vengeance turned once more. Edward II's reign had ended in ruin, but his life and his death cast a long shadow. To some, he was a weak and foolish monarch undone by his passions. To others, he was a man destroyed by a world unwilling to accept the loves he cherished and the weaknesses he could not overcome. Either way, Edward II remains one of the most tragic and enigmatic kings in English history. His story is not just that of a failed ruler, it is the tale of a man caught between love and duty, loyalty and betrayal, power and vulnerability, a king who in the end could not escape the cruelty of his age. The legacy of a fallen king, Edward II's life ended in captivity, but his story refused to stay buried. His reign was a cautionary tale to contemporaries and a fascination to generations that followed, a mixture of tragedy, scandal, and myth that continues to captivate. In the immediate aftermath, his legacy was one of shame. To his barons and subjects, Edward II was the king who squandered his inheritance, who lost Scotland at Bannockburn, who let favourites rule in his stead, and who was deposed by his own queen. For medieval chroniclers, most of them clerics, sympathetic to the baronial cause, he became the embodiment of weakness, unfit for the crown he wore. His deposition in 1327 set a dangerous precedent that a king of England could be judged, overthrown, and replaced by force. Future monarchs would remember this with unease. Yet over time, the memory of Edward II softened. His tomb at Gloucester Cathedral became a site of quiet reverence. Far from being left to obscurity, it was rebuilt in the lavish Perpendicular Gothic style by his son Edward III, who perhaps sought to rehabilitate his father's image. Pilgrims visited, donations were made, and the dead king's soul was prayed for. Whatever his failings in life, in death he was still an anointed monarch, and the medieval mind held such sanctity and awe. His story also became entangled with legend. The lurid tale of his murder by red-hot poker gripped imaginations across Europe, retold in chronicle after chronicle. It served as both a moral fable warning of the dangers of sin and indulgence and a salacious gossip that underscored the cruelty of Isabella and Mortimer. Whether true or not, it ensured Edward II's name would never fade into mere obscurity. In literature and drama, his memory took on new life. The Elizabethan playwright Christopher Marlowe made him the subject of Edward II, one of the first great English history plays, focusing on the king's passion for Gaveston and the political consequences of that love. For Marlowe, Edward became less a failed monarch than a tragic hero, undone by desire and betrayed by those closest to him. In modern times, historians and novelists alike have revisited his reign, often with more sympathy, exploring themes of sexuality, identity, and the crushing weight of medieval kingship today. Edward II is remembered not only as a weak ruler, but also as a human figure, flawed, vulnerable, and more complex than the caricature painted by his enemies. He was a king unsuited to the brutal world of medieval politics, where martial strength and iron will defined success. Yet he was also a man who dared to love openly, who found comfort in companions that scandalized his court, and who paid the ultimate price for both his affections and his failures. Edward II's life is a reminder that kingship was never simply about crowns and battles. It was about survival in a world that left little room for softness, intimacy, or weakness. And in that harsh age, Edward's humanity, his passions, his dependencies, his vulnerabilities proved both his most endearing quality and his ultimate undoing. Thus, he remains one of history's most tragic monarchs, a king who lost his throne, perhaps his dignity, but never his place in the imagination of England. Edward II, the tragedy of a king. On a cold February day in 1308, the bells of Westminster rang out as Edward II, King of England, took his bride, Isabella of France. She was a princess of barely 12, draped in French silks and crowned with jewels, daughter of the formidable Philip IV, the Iron King. He was 23, handsome, tall, and the newly anointed ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. To the world it was a dynastic triumph, the union of two great royal houses, England and France. To Edward, however, it was little more than a distraction. For though Isabella was young, beautiful, and politically invaluable, Edward's heart lay elsewhere. In the glittering ceremonies of his coronation, in the very marriage festivities themselves, the king's attentions were fixed not on his bride, but on another man, Piers Gaveston. The king and his favorite Gaveston was everything Edward craved, and everything his court despised: witty, daring, flamboyant, and of relatively modest birth. Their bond had begun years earlier, when Edward was still prince, and by the time he wore the crown, Gaveston was not just a companion but a fixation. The king lavished titles, lands, and honors upon him, even seating him at the center of the coronation feast where Isabella should have been honored. Chroniclers, scandalized, recorded Edward's obsession in tones of disapproval, noting that he loved him beyond measure. To the barons, this favoritism was intolerable. Gaveston's arrogance matched the king's indulgence, and he delighted in mocking England's great lords with nicknames that stung like barbed wire. Their envy curdled into fury. To them, Gaveston was not simply a nuisance, he was a usurper of royal influence, a parasite upon the crown. Again and again Edward was forced by his nobles to exile Gaveston, and again he recalled him, unable to bear the separation. The cycle of banishment and return played out until 1312, when the barons took matters into their own hands. Gaveston was captured, dragged to Warwick Castle, and executed without trial. Edward was inconsolable. The grief-stricken king buried his beloved with regal honors, but something inside him broke. He would never forgive the nobles who had taken Gaveston from him. Bannockburn, the humiliation of a king of Gaveston's death, shattered Edward's heart. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 shattered his reputation. Seeking to emulate his father, Edward I, the fearsome hammer of the Scots, the young king led a massive army north to crush Robert the Bruce and relieve the besieged English garrison at Stirling Castle. What followed was catastrophe. The Scots, outnumbered but brilliantly, drew Edward's forces into marshy ground. Their Chiltern's dense formations of spearmen shredded English cavalry, while panic spread through the ranks. Chroniclers tell of chaos, knights trampling one another in retreat, the king himself barely escaping capture. Edward fled the field, riding hard for the safety of Dunbar and leaving behind an army in ruin. Bannockburn was more than a defeat, it was a humiliation. England's great warrior tradition was mocked, its king branded a coward, where Edward I had ruled through fear. Edward II became an object of ridicule. His authority at home, already fragile, crumbled further. The Despensers and the Queen. Into this void stepped Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had been a playful companion, Despenser was a ruthless manipulator. Handsome, ambitious, and married into the royal family, he quickly became indispensable to Edward. The king's affection for him was intense, his reliance absolute. Together with his father, the elder Hugh Despenser, he amassed land and power with breathtaking greed. But the Despensers' rise bred hatred. Their tyranny stripped nobles of lands and humiliated Edward's queen, Isabella. Her estates were seized, her influence crushed, her dignity trampled by a favorite who treated her with contempt. Isabella, daughter of the Iron King, was not one to suffer humiliation quietly. When Edward sent her to France in 1325 to negotiate a truce, she saw her chance. In Paris, free from the Despensers' grip, she allied herself with Roger Mortimer, an exiled lord with his own vendetta. Their partnership was scandalous, rumored to be both political and romantic, but it was also formidable. In 1326, they invaded England with a small army. The response was astonishing. Edward and the Despensers discovered that years of cruelty had left them friendless. Nobles, commons, even towns turned eagerly to Isabella's cause. Within weeks, the regime collapsed. Edward fled west with Despenser, but their flight ended in capture. Despenser's fate was ghastly. Tried as a traitor, he was hanged, disemboweled, and quartered before cheering crowds. Edward, stripped of his crown, was imprisoned at Kenilworth and forced in January 1327 to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son. The once mighty king wept as he relinquished his crown. Berkeley Castle. Death and legend. Edward was sent into captivity at Berkeley Castle, a bleak fortress of stone and shadows. There, in September 1327, word spread of his death. How he died remains one of history's great mysteries. The most infamous account claims he was murdered by the insertion of a red-hot poker act, both gruesome and symbolic, designed to leave no outward marks while mocking his reputed sexuality. The tale horrified Europe, ensuring his death would never be forgotten. Yet historians doubt the story's truth. Some argue Edward was starved or smothered, others that he died of illness or neglect. A few even suggest he escaped, living out his days in obscurity on the continent. What is certain is that by autumn of 1327, Edward II was gone, his broken body interred in Gloucester Cathedral beneath a tomb of surprising grandeur, commissioned by his son. Legacy of a tragic king. Edward II's legacy is one of paradox to his contemporaries. He was a failed monarch, a man who lost Scotland, squandered his inheritance, and allowed unworthy favorites to rule in his stead. His deposition set a precedent that haunted future kings. The knowledge that even an anointed sovereign could be overthrown. Yet in death, his memory softened. Pilgrims came to his tomb, offerings were made, and his soul prayed for. Later generations, from chroniclers to playwrights, found in his story not just weakness but tragedy. Christopher Marlowe's Edward II immortalized him as a tragic figure, undone by forbidden love, betrayed by wife and realm alike. Today, Edward II is remembered less as a tyrant than as a man caught in the brutal machinery of medieval kingship, a king whose humanity, his loves and vulnerabilities, doomed him in a world that demanded only strength. He remains one of England's most tragic monarchs, a ruler destroyed not only by his enemies but by the very qualities that made him most human. That's the complete, seamless narrative of Edward II's life, downfall, and legacy.